Michael, thank you for joining us. This is something. It's more of a it's my little passion project. So I'm very glad to have you as one of the guests, and I chose you because you are one of the most interesting characters at the ActionSA.
Not sure how to read that. Interesting. It's kind of like one of those double-edged compliments, isn't it?
Well, in as much, I mean, you've written a book, but you've written a book about someone else. So we'd like to know more about you. And I think let's start with when Michael was born. You're a Durban boy, born and bred. Just tell us more about where you were born, the influences when you were still in Durban.
Yeah, they call them brews, Durban brews. But yeah, no, I was born in Durban in 1985, so I'm 39 this year. And born to an incredibly fortunate situation. I think in the South African context, I grew up in probably the most privileged environment you can. My father was a surgeon, my mum was a radiographer. They're still married after many, many years of marriage. And I had the good fortune of attending really good schools. So, I live on the complete other side of the spectrum on privilege. But I think what's important to me always is to be very mindful of that particular fortunate upbringing that I've had. It's always an interesting thing for me that in ActionSA, we have a president who was born to a child-headed household living in a tin shack. And then you have my story, and yet we bring it together in a party that seems to have, to some extent, found expression in both sides of the railway track in terms of its support base. So, yeah, it was a interesting upbringing. It was, I think, a very sheltered upbringing, and certainly took a while for me to develop the level of political consciousness that I think informed a lot of my political choices to follow.
Let's talk about that political consciousness and where exactly is the genesis of it, because you went from Michael House to Rhodes University. Did you find that consciousness at Rhodes University? Is that where the genesis lies?
It actually started in high school. I had a Zulu teacher, Mr. Sandile Kuluse. I still remember his name. And, anyone who's had a really special teacher knows the kind of role a special teacher has in your life. And he was that for me. I suspect in hindsight he was very IFP by way of his upbringing. And he immediately looked at my argumentative and strongly opinionated nature and said, "You're going to be a politician."
Oh, really?
And I said to him, "No, you're talking nonsense. There's no way. I'd never say that, by the way." I politely said I disagreed or whatever. But he saw that in me from the beginning, and he started to develop a bit of political consciousness with me, which I thought was quite instructive in those early years. And then certainly when I went to Rhodes, it was a very interesting experience, because Rhodes is an institution that's steeped in history when it comes to the struggle against apartheid. We had some very strong lecturers there who certainly awoke a level of consciousness with me. I was actually in the same political class as Mandela Mandela. So I had those interactions with him, and we explored a lot about the ANC at the time. So certainly, I think it grew at that point, and my love of politics grew. I actually studied politics actually as a random subject, not that I really wanted to pursue a career in politics. But if you have a political bug, which I do, and you get bitten, it's very difficult to let go. And I know that I did some VAC work as part of building up a CV with the Democratic Alliance and KZN at the time. And the political bug bit me. I was working with MPs and understanding the work that they were doing, and found it hugely interesting. And 3 days after my last exam, I started my first job in politics, which will be 18 years ago next year. So my political career is almost old enough to drink. So I think there's something in that metaphor. And certainly, as I say, the rest will be history.
Now, when you look at, and let's perhaps go back to your Zulu teacher, and when you look at where you come from and juxtapose it with your Zulu teacher who came from the IFP, were you ever, even though it was at the periphery in terms of your upbringing, but were you ever conscious of what was happening in KZN, and especially, during the most tumultuous time during the Nelson Mandela years, when there was almost a civil war, as one would put it, black on black violence at that time. Were you aware of such things that were happening in your backyard?
To some extent. I think my very privileged upbringing certainly kept a lot of that stuff far away from my backyard. So, certainly I think for many people with a similar story to mine, it took a lot longer to realize what was going on. I also think, to be fair, that civil war kind of conflict element began when I was about 5 years old. So I think my political consciousness was still in nappies at the time. So definitely not something that I was too aware around. But, I do remember a bit later on in life, certainly around the early years of the democracy, various things started happening in schools when the new flag was being introduced and the national anthem and elements associated with the new democracy. There were particular moments where you started to be conscientized, even in a small way, about the changes, and you started asking questions. I think it always took place in an interesting environment, though, because that Durban English-speaking, so-called liberal kind of environment, often, some folk there have a very subtle forms of racist behavior, condescending and patronizing. And I think in many ways I was confronted by racism, and I knew at a young age that I hated racism. It offended me at a young age. I think I always had a very strong sense of justice, and I couldn't understand why that was acceptable. So I think it was more, smaller levels of consciousness that developed over time. And certainly as I sunk my teeth into politics, I have avidly pursued books and stories about this country's history and the leaders who were so important in its development, and looked to consume as much as I could in the absence of those early years, I suppose.
Now you're at Rhodes University. You obviously, taking in all of that history, especially in the Eastern Cape. What then influenced you to go to the DA? Why not the ANC?
Well, actually, I'd always been more aligned to the ANC at the time. And in many ways, I bought into the romance of what the ANC was in terms of the struggle, and its icons and its leaders and what it had brought to the table. But I think by that time, it was starting to emerge that the honeymoon of the ANC was coming to an end, in as much as it was starting to be revealed in fairly kind of technicolor detail that what the ANC was in liberation wasn't necessarily translated into its governing prowess. I think certainly there were moments associated with the ANC's approach to Zimbabwe and ZANU-PF that I found deeply concerning. And I think it was at that moment that I looked at the DA and thought, this is not a perfect political party by all means, but that there does need to be another strong political party in South Africa, and I could get behind this. I met some of the people involved in the DA at the time. They were just going through a fairly big set of changes because Helen Zille had just been elected the DA leader back in 2006. And I suppose it was at that time that I believed that this would be the right move to make.
If you can just give us an idea of the conversations that you had in varsity. I mean, I imagine it was robust debate between different students about where the country was leaning and the vision that you had for the country.
It was. And I think one of the most amazing things about Rhodes University is by the time you get to an honours level, you probably have about 12 students in your class. And you have such a kind of intermittent interactions with your lecturers that quite often you sit at a table at the pub together, or you get hosted for a dinner at their house, and you interact on a very personable level. But it was interesting. As I said, we had some interesting people like Mandela Mandela there, and there were a lot of debates going around, and I think at the time, particularly around the question of the cycles of violence that you spoke about just now in the early 90s, and the kind of elements associated with that. There was a lot about electoral systems and voting behavior, which is something I specialized in, which looked quite largely at the question of whether voting patterns in South Africa were racial and would remain racial going forward. I think certainly that was a subject of a great deal of debate. And then particularly around South African political history, it was always a heated discussion because, of course, any discussion with history occasions people to challenge what they're being taught and the points of emphasis. And it was just really interesting to be surrounded by people who were intellectually engaged in the discussion, and people with different perspectives and vastly different to my own. So in many ways, you found yourself learning as much from your fellow students as you did from the lecturers.
Take me through now. You go back to Durban and then you start working for the DA. What exactly was the position you held there, and what were the your ambitions in the DA? Did you ever think of entering the politics of the party?
So my first job was called a constituency operations manager. It was for the constituency called North Durban, which, if you know Durban, was everything north of the Mngeni River.
Yes.
So Durban North, Umhlanga, Lelusia in terms of the suburbs, Phoenix, Tongaat, Verulam in terms of those communities, and the whole of KwaMashu. So it was a hugely diverse, hugely challenging view. I knew absolutely nothing. I was wet behind the ears. I was immersed into a world of snakes and sharks. And particularly I found the politics in Phoenix was eye-opening. You had the minority front there, and the National Party still did very well for a long time in those communities. And it was a deep learning experience. I didn't think it was more about ambitions at the time. I think it was just about surviving. But I thrived. I was in a space that I liked. I enjoyed political communication. It was a very junior position. So I literally worked my way up from the very bottom. But soaked up everything I could like a sponge, which was exactly what I did. And no, to answer the question, I avoided frontline politics for the longest time in my life, right up till the start of ActionSA. I've always worked in the background. I've enjoyed the background as a space where you can do a hell of a lot. And you can avoid many of the pitfalls of being in the front line. But in the beginning, it was just about learning as much as I possibly could from as many people as I could.
Now, I imagine you worked with personalities within the DA. You worked with John Steenhuisen, who comes from Durban as well. You worked with Mbali Nduli, who also was a Durbanite or KZN person as well. Tell me about those personalities. How was working with those personalities?
Well, it's interesting. So, John was actually a member of the constituency, that first constituency as I was a part of. He was a ward councillor in Durban North, and he was the eThekwini caucus leader at the time. So we are going way back in history. But there were lots of interesting characters from around that time. Mbali didn't emerge for a number of years later. It was quite funny. During my term as the provincial director of KZN, I went through a recruitment process where Mbali was recruited. I was very excited with working with her. And it was just hugely entertaining, though, because Mbali is such a character and so magnetic in her nature that it didn't take long before I was making her coffee. And totally we laugh about it today because she just has one of those personalities that makes you happy to do it. And, obviously her political career just took off in every single way. I think she's probably been one of the greatest losses in South African politics, I would say. But lots of interesting characters for good and bad reasons, I suppose.
When you look at, the DA during your time kind of ebbed and flowed, and there were different periods where there were significant changes. I would think of, for instance, Mbali leaving, Mmusi Maimane leaving, which we'll get to later on, and also Lindy Wes leaving. How impactful was Lindy Wes' departure from the DA?
Sure, I think it was massive. I think the first thing though to say is that between 2007, when I joined, and right up till Lindy Wes' departure, the party just grew at every single election. Things had always been going very well for the DA at that time. The wind was in its sails. Lindy Wes' departure was impactful, but for different reasons. A lot of the people who departed later departed because of a kind of change in the organization's direction. I think Lindy Wes departed because of the manner she was treated by Helen and other people in the party. And I think that was a big eye-opening moment because you had this young, dynamic, charismatic woman who was reshaping the DA in the direction we all wanted because, no one's can be blind to the fact that the DA was always an imperfect party. I wasn't, certainly, and I've never believed that parties are perfect. I think they are imperfect, and you try and make them better. And here you had Lindy Wes, who was moving mountains and really putting the DA in a realm where it's challenging the perception to the DA as a white party, which was always the biggest Achilles heel for the organisation. And then when you basically had that blowout and Lindy Wes leaving, it was a kind of statement that the DA is going to remain what it always was. And I think that was a major blow to the organisation, certainly. And I think years to come, the other departures took place for different reasons, but they really did take a major dent in the project of diversifying the DA. The DA I grew up in, I'm talking about when I was on the ground daily. I remember that organisation. If you were at an event and you didn't have a diverse table of leaders at the top, I mean, you'd be stripped down and whipped because the party was so sensitive about projecting itself in terms of where it was going and having the diversity and being a home for all South Africans. And that's what just makes it so odd to look at the DA now, where it's just done a complete 180 on those values. And it's just odd because the same people who are driving that now were driving the different approach back then.
So in your time, from what I'm gauging, is that in your time, you never really noticed, or there wasn't, as you said, it is an imperfect, every organization is imperfect, but there wasn't really a distinction, a massive distinction between black and white during your time. Would you say that?
In terms of?
In terms of the race relations in the DA.
In the party?
Yes.
Oh, no, there was always a major issue there. There was always. It was always bubbling under the surface. And it was always a cause of tension because effectively the project of diversifying the party, which a lot of people bought into, myself included, was hugely important and necessary. I mean, just if you just have an appreciation of maths, you understand. If you aim to govern and deliver and change lives, you've got to be in the aspirations of a majority of the country. But to others, it was a threat to their very existence. And I wouldn't be out of line to suggest that a lot of people who, let's just say, would be unemployable outside of politics, underqualified, pale males, let's call them, were hugely threatened by that project because they were the ones that stood to lose out. And there was always a tension bubbling under. I think the difference was in those early days in KZN, I was still relatively junior. So I experienced it at a very different level. I wasn't part of the national decision-making structures of the party at that point. But certainly it watched how it played out, and you observed it carefully in the political leaders around you from KZN engaging around what was going in those national meetings. And certainly that was eye-opening.
I want to now get to the late and former Federal Council Chair, James Self, and perhaps if you could share his influence on your life and professionally. How was that relationship?
It was a very important one to me. It only started, though, when Herman Mashaba became the mayor of Joburg and I became Herman's chief of staff. Because ultimately there had to be interactions between the mayor and the party in terms of the government. And I think everyone, Herman included, kind of said, look, Herman's not a party guy. Don't kind of bog me down with this kind of stuff. I just want to go and be the mayor. So a lot of that was for me to be the interface between our government and the party and providing the relative assurances about what was being done and the management of crises. And that had me interacting a lot with James on a daily basis. And it was just a huge, huge persona. Probably one of the most undervalued people in South African politics. And he rubbed off on me in a big way. He's got a wonderful way of dealing with stress with humor. And yet there must have been so much stress in his life. He always operated with a high degree of precision and excellence in what he did. I used to love his command of the English language. I find language to be one of the most powerful things when language is weaponized in a political cause. And I definitely learned a lot from him in that regard. And certainly I know now in the work that I do as the national chairman of ActionSA, even though comparatively the organisations are of different sizes, I still draw a lot on the things that I learned from James in those early years.
Now, I want to talk about you moving from Durban to Johannesburg. And maybe this might be very uncomfortable and an uncomfortable question, because there was a lot of talk about why you had to move from Durban to Johannesburg. And maybe you could just clear up the rumors that still exist around that, and without delving too much into your personal life. But if you could just share what was the reason for the transition, and if it had anything to do with the current leader of the DA.
Okay. No, look, for what it's worth, there's no problem. I'm open book in these regards, but they were largely two separate events. There was some degree of relation. But, effectively, and I think it's commonly known that I was married in 2010 to someone I worked with in KZN. And about 3 months into our marriage, she began an affair with John Steenhuisen, who was the DA provincial leader at the time. And obviously I was the provincial director, he was the leader. And that's kind of like the SG and president of another party. So you're working together daily. We were very close and interacting very closely, which made things terribly difficult. It was a difficult time, and it was a terrible thing to go through. Because it was a hugely public matter. I know it had a terrible impact on my family, who are really private people. They're not like me. They're not open to having their names splashed around like that. And it was a difficult thing to go through, but we went through it anyway. And a lot of people try to make the story about who I am politically now in 2024. And I think they do so fairly maliciously, because we're talking back 2010. We're talking ancient history now. And to give you the idea, I remained in the DA for 9 years after that incident. So, there's certainly nothing about my political choices today that have anything to do with those events. Those events are ancient history. John is happily married. I'm happily married. I've been married for 7 years. In many ways, I think it was a blessing in my life. So, it was a difficult thing to go through, but, certainly not something that framed my politics or framed who I am in any way. But my reason for leaving was, I suppose, partly informed by that. He had stepped down as the DA leader at KZN at the time, and I was working with Sizwe Mqunu at the time. But I think the decision to go to Gauteng was also largely driven by the opportunity there was in Gauteng. In KZN, you're an opposition party in perpetuity. The DA is not going to govern KZN outright at the time until Jesus comes. It was fairly clear. And
doesn't look like it ever will, in fact.
Well, yeah, I think it's fairly safe now. But, the point is, Gauteng was an interesting place because you had a lot more voters who were mobile in their political choices. You had a fascinating dynamic that the 2014 election was shaping up in such a way where it was going to be a dead shootout between the ANC and the DA. Both were tracking in the 40s, and you could have very easily had a government there. The EFF obviously really threw a kind of hand grenade into that, a whole nother story. But I think the opportunity to go to Gauteng was exciting for me. And I must tell you, looking back, I've absolutely loved it, because I think this is a province that operates at my pace. I like the pace of life. I love the vibrancy of Gauteng. Even when I go to places like Cape Town, no matter how beautiful it is, I love Joburg. And I think I'm always going to be a Joburg person.
Now you get here, and during and you become Herman Mashaba's chief of staff, and you talking about how Herman wasn't really a party man. He was all about, I just want to do the job. And we had the same inclination when we were looking at Herman as well. Our opinion was that he was not really a party man, which he has always hasn't been shy to say so himself. But how difficult was it to manage a Herman Mashaba?
Let me just be clear, you don't manage Herman Mashaba. Herman is his own person. And I say that proudly, and often because people try to be malicious about the story. Herman is a 64-year-old man He's achieved major things in life. He certainly doesn't need someone in his 30s managing him. If anything, I think what there was an appreciation that there was a kind of balancing of one another, which worked quite well. In that I'd been in the party, I'd been in party politics, and we could certainly complement one another's blind spots a little bit. It was, to answer your question, it was hugely challenging and entertaining and thrilling and exciting all at the same time. But you could look back now and laugh at it, but I suppose at the time you really did want to tear your hair out because the DA was going through a phase where it just now entered all these metros. And I mean, anyone will tell you the DA's nature in those situations is to become micromanaging. They want to know where the paper clips are and, that level of detail. And Herman's a big picture guy. Don't bog him down to the paper clips. It's not his thing. So when we had those interactions, it was often about managing those interactions where quite often, Herman would turn around and say, listen, if you don't trust me to do this job, you can bring someone else in. I didn't ask for this job. You asked me to do it. And I suppose what just emerged that was so interesting there is that every other political leader I'd worked with, they owed their position and any future position to how the leadership loved them or how they served the leadership. Whereas Herman's like, guys, I didn't apply for this job. You asked me to stand for it. I've got other things to do in my life. This is a terrible job, but I'm doing it because I love my country. And what it created was a dynamic where the party leadership became terrified of him because he was this uncontrollable guy. And I don't mean uncontrollable in a bad way. I mean uncontrollable in the sense that he couldn't be controlled.
He was independent
by his future ambitions. He wasn't trying to be the premier candidate and endearing himself to party leadership. He just wanted to govern Joburg well. And that was terrifying to a lot of people. And that's why I think for that transition the DA went through and that kind of hostile takeover that took place in the DA between 2016 and 2019, Herman was the lightning rod for a lot of that, which is interesting because on one hand, he wasn't a party guy, so he was never going to be challenging anyone for leadership or anything of that nature. But the fact that he wasn't going to be controlled, the fact that he wasn't someone who could be put under a thumb made him a massive threat to some people. And I suppose the fact that he started to make some achievements in a place like Joburg, breaking the narrative about things, also made him a massive threat to some of those people as well.
Do you think that you were...
sorry, before you go, I have to share. There's some funny stories, though, because this brings in James Self, which is where it gets funny. So Herman holds the record for firing the most MMCs of any mayor. And I often had to be the one who would take Herman's request to the party and facilitate, because to fire an MMC in a political party requires a political process in the background. And it was with great humor. The first time I phoned James, he's like, okay, fine, let's do this, we'll do that, we'll get it done. The second time he's umming and ahhing. The third time James answered the phone with an expletive I won't repeat, saying, who's he firing now? So it became a source like that, but it was interesting operating with someone who was entirely not political in their makeup and the way they operated.
I perhaps now will ask you if do you think that you were the casualty in in the Herman Mashaba versus the party fight or battle?
There's no question at the time, I was picking sides. You can't be in that position and serve two masters. And what was just interesting at the time, though, is that the people in charge of the DA at the time were the people that were aligned to Herman. It was the people who were taking over the DA at the time who were not. So it wasn't so much that I was interfacing with those people, but certainly, it was a strange situation where a lot of those people would see me as a threat, imagining somehow the role I was playing. And I remember to this day that when Herman made that speech resigning, and he obviously, as Herman tends to, kind of speak.
Who wrote that speech, by the way? Was it you? There's been talks that it was you who wrote that speech.
I don't remember. I mean, look, there's always people who contribute to a speech. The one thing I can tell you, though, is that Herman has the final say on what he says and the way in which he says it. So certainly I could tell you that would have definitely been the case. But I remember I went home that evening. I was very deflated. I was dealing with a team of staff members who were now basically unemployed. to whom, I was responsible for looking after them. So it wasn't my happiest moment in politics. And I got a WhatsApp from Helen Zille saying, like, did you write that speech in the traditional Helen Zille way? Like, no, congratulations on all that you've achieved, and I hope you guys are all right, or any of those kind of things. And I remember just being insanely irritated at the time. And I just said, as someone who served as a political principal, I'm sure you'll imagine that whoever writes a speech is secondary to whoever delivers it. And if you have issues with what's in the speech, you should take it up with that person. So it was very clear that the target was on my back at that time. But I didn't leave because there was a target on my back. I left because the organization in 2019 was unrecognizable to the one that I joined in 2007. And for that reason, I took the decision to say that I can't be here. And I took that decision because I didn't get into politics to serve a political party. I got into politics to serve a political ideal. And political parties come and go. They are vehicles. And I'm certainly not someone who will hop from one party to another in the fashion of a Jimmy Manyi or an Abel Tau or any of these characters. But if the party that I'm in is not serving its intended purpose and the reason why I've got there, I cannot be a rent seeker and just stick around because they pay my bills. I have to move on, and I have to create something that's going to serve my agenda.
So when you wrote that letter, terminating your membership, who did you refer it to? And what was the reaction of the political leadership at that time?
Well, I actually sent it to John Moody, who was at the time the DA provincial leader, and Mike Moriarty, who was at the time the DA provincial chairperson, both of whom had been kind of mentors in my life. When I came to Gauteng, we'd worked together very closely from day one. But I don't think any of them were surprised. I think they knew. I think, firstly, they knew about the way in which we had become a lightning rod to those people who were taking over the DA. I think they were sympathetic to what we had gone through. And I think at the same time, there was a difference. I think they agreed with every issue I had with the DA. It was their issues too, if I read between the lines right. I mean, John obviously left and joined ActionSA, so very clearly so. But I don't think my resignation came as a surprise to either of them. But it was a very low-key event. I didn't publicly resign. It wasn't a press conference. I don't think anyone would have known who I was, quite frankly. At the time, I was completely in the back office. But it was nonetheless a very strange and quiet moment. And I guess what was just so strange about it is I'd served the DA for 11 years at the time, which is no joke. And it was probably one of the quietest departures anyone would ever not have noticed.
Were you disappointed by the non-reaction from the leadership, given how much you had contributed to the party, both here and nationally as well?
No, I don't think so. Look, nationally, I wasn't surprised. At that time, I think Helen had been elected. Mmusi had resigned. John was the acting leader, and I certainly wasn't anticipating any tears to be rolling down their collective cheeks. But, in terms of the provincial leadership here, not really. I think in many ways they identified with a lot of the issues I took with the party. And they had been part of that journey in the city of Joburg, which had soured with the party. They had worked very hard, by the way, to save that relationship. They saw the value of what was going on there. And I think they were as frustrated as I was, because here you have people who have given so much of their lives, John and Mike so much more than I have, to making the DA a vehicle that's more appealing to more people. They understood that. And here you have the DA now running Johannesburg, which is, the biggest opportunity you can ever imagine. And we found ourselves doing things that were, you can't do in opposition. In opposition, all you can do is bang the table and send out statements and produce hot air. But here we were in government electrifying Kliptown, the home of the Freedom Charter, 16 years into our democracy. I mean, that's a massive, massive moment. And when you walk away from that, you walk away from the opportunity to deliver trust, because you can't speak trust away. If the majority of the country doesn't trust your organization, the only way you're going to change that is if you go and deliver real services to them in such a way that you show people you care. And I think walking away from that opportunity and the party collapsing that opportunity was, something that probably stuck in the throats of all three of us at the time.
Now, I want to get into what you're saying before I get into the book, The Accidental Mayor, which I think a lot of people who are, more especially people who live in Gauteng, need to really read. But I want to talk about the missed opportunity of the DA, because that was, Herman Mashaba at that point was at his most popular in terms of the communities of Johannesburg, and what the reception he was getting was that he was doing a good job, and the reaction was that he was doing a stellar job, not only from communities but from political parties, both in the coalition and otherwise. Do you think that the DA was primarily focused on its own interests, personal interests, or do you think that the relationship between the Herman Mashaba and the DA was so irreparable that nothing could, and so damaged that nothing could do to kind of repair any of the issues that both party and the man had?
So it's hard to say, because at the time the DA was a schizophrenic organization. There were two DAs. The DA with which we identified had just lost the battle for the heart of the DA. With the election of Helen Zille, etc., and the resignation of Mmusi, that part of the DA had lost. So there was massive resonance with that part of the DA and Herman. In fact, that part of the DA was trying to convince Herman to challenge for leadership of the party in that particular moment. But it was the other side of the DA that had taken over that was massively opposed to everything Herman stood for and who he was and what he was doing. And the problem was those are the people who had the levers of power. And if you have an understanding of how the internal party machinery works, incumbency is a massive advantage in dealing with these situations. And what we just dealt with on a daily level was just so irretrievable in terms of the breakdown, because basically they would weaponize the relationship with the party and our government to the point where, someone would write up a negative story about our government, which, in politics that happens every day. In other words, you can't live and die on whether there's a negative view. But they would snowball that into a proverbial mountain, and suddenly there would be investigations and whatnot over absolutely nothing. And it was fun. You'd go through weeks and months of dealing with them and showing them that this is nonsense and this is what's being done and this is why it's all right, etc. And then they would move on from that one to the next thing. And eventually it was just becoming so all-consuming for our time when we were trying to govern and trying to focus on what was going on that it became quite difficult to really manage things in that kind of way. So I think it was irretrievable in terms of those who were in power and the direction the DA was moving in. I think for what it's worth, if you look at the DA then and the DA now, I mean, that concern has been vindicated, because if anything, they kept going in that direction. They didn't kind of self-correct and land up somewhere more in the middle. So definitely, irretrievable, I would say.
What was your relationship with Mmusi Maimane at that time? And what was your reaction and opinion about Mmusi Maimane, both his resignation as well as how he was conducting himself within the party? Because there were a lot of people, especially the black leaders, who felt that Mmusi Maimane was not really in union with them. Mmusi Maimane was the man, the party man, and someone who was leaning more on the white leadership of the DA, and that they didn't have him as an anchor for the black caucus. I think they were called the Black Caucus at that time, if I remember the terminology. But what was your own opinion about Mmusi and how he conducted himself as a leader?
It's challenging to say. I've never been particularly close with Mmusi. We had a strained relationship for different reasons, but when he was the premier candidate for the province in 2014, there were a lot of people who, felt, sentiments against him because he just come in and got all these opportunities and just risen straight to the top, etc. And I think in many ways that caused distrust between him and I, even though we never actually had a problem between the two of us. He just kind of rolled in different circles, and for that reason we didn't really have a close relationship. But, his tenure as the leader was an interesting one, because in 2016, under his leadership, the party reached the heights of 24%. I mean, 1 in 4 South Africans were DA voter back then. So definitely his election had a massive effect. But I think sometimes there was, an extent to which he became beholden to certain people who he deemed had helped him get to where he was. And it was unfortunate, because I think he underestimated his own agency. And I think part of the reason why Herman felt he had to leave was because, when Mmusi needed to stand up and be the leader, he didn't. At that time, when the review report came out, it was the most strangest thing. I mean, Mmusi signed off on this review committee of the former leader, the former CEO, and an influential DA donor. I mean, everyone around him was saying, don't do it. It's a setup. I mean, obviously, it's like Back to the Future, like what's going on here. And yet he did. And then when the report came out, which, obviously, just went after him almost entirely, he had every right to turn around then and say, well, you know what, let's call a conference and let's ask the structures of the DA who should lead. And, Mmusi was elected with a 95% kind of mandate in 2015. He would have walked an elective conference back then had he done so. And I do remember at the time, Herman and other leaders of the party were saying, lead, we'll follow you, we're behind you, but you must lead. You have to take that first step. And I don't know why, but it never happened. And I think that's why when there was this transition towards the DA, as it is now, it's where there was no hope for people like Herman and I.
I want to ask about The Accidental Mayor. When did you start drafting that book? because it was eye-opening in terms of when you came into government, what you saw, the rot in Johannesburg, but also eye-opening in terms of him and his position in the party as well. So it would be interesting to hear when you started crafting that book.
It's the strangest thing, I mean, because it was never intentioned to be a book. I actually had the habit late in the evening when I couldn't sleep. I'd start writing the things that were going on. And I almost did it as part of like a therapy exercise, because when you go into the city, you're just so shell-shocked by what you're experiencing and the sheer kind of like, traumatic disorder that you kind of get confronted by, that I started writing this stuff down. And before long, it started taking shape. And I remember in our final months in office, I finally said to Herman, you must have a look at this. I've done this. I don't quite know why I've done this, but I think there's a story that should be told here. Just because, the sheer novelty of an outsider coming into politics at the time in which its party was going through this internal kind of coup, while governing a city successfully, but in a madly chaotic environment. I mean, it just came together like a political horror. And yet there was so much in it. So eventually it became the book. We published it, and literally it was supposed to be on the shelves, I think 2 weeks after the COVID lockdowns began. So it was one of those things where eventually 3 months into this lockdown, the publishers, Penguin and I, were like, well, we're going to have to make it available somehow, otherwise this thing's going to get old. So it was made available, but obviously greatly impacted by the time, like so many other things were in COVID lockdowns. I think it came with 4 lawsuits at one time, which, interestingly enough, all went nowhere. And I'm so happy we've gone past that prescription period now where they can't, because it's a terrible thing when you start getting legal letters, etc. But a massively eye-opening experience, and it was interesting to share because at that time, I had always been in the background in politics, and here I was very publicly telling a story. So it was deeply uncomfortable, and yet kind of got the sense it was a story that needed to be told.
Cathartic, as it were.
Yeah, I think it was. There was definitely some therapy in there somewhere.
I then want to find from you, I mean, Herman starting this political party, was this something that you set? And I hear that Herman loves his wine. Set and had a glass of wine, and then you decided to form a political party. What was the conversations that were led up to ActionSA taking shape?
So it was actually a couple of months before Herman left. I mean, I think Herman saw the writing on the wall when it came to the direction the DA was going in. And we were in a flight somewhere on the way back from somewhere, 40,000 feet in the air, when he dropped this bomb on me. So we should start our own party. And I said, no, Herman, I don't think we should. Because obviously I have a much more keen understanding of what not creating, none of us knew that, but what running a political party meant, and kind of political entrepreneurship is definitely not for the faint-hearted. I knew that at the time, and I know it a whole lot more right now. But I kind of said, no, Herman, we can't do this. And he was bullish because, Herman, as he tends to be, says, Michael, we can go into business, but for what? If our country is going to continue in this direction, I mean, what are we going to do in business and for how long? So I kind of reluctantly agreed, and we started exploring it. And Andre Kutsia, the other co-founder of the party, bought into it, which was hugely important because he's the silent partner that very few people talk about, but he's in many ways been the brain of the operation. And we made this at the same time.
And I mean, in terms of when you were engaging people during this dialogue, a lot of us thought that you would rope in Mmusi Maimane as well, and it would be a collaboration between these two powerful DA leaders, as they both held agency at that point. And I think Mmusi's popularity was starting to dwindle when ActionSA was forming, and he was still doing his own thing. Were the discussions with Mmusi Maimane around him coming in, and why didn't he come in?
There were, and they were dangerously close to happening. But ultimately, there was always this challenge that I think Mmusi had to imagine himself as the leader of the party. And I mean, I sort of get that because, being the leader of the official opposition, being the leader of the opposition in parliament, etc. And, Herman was like, of the mind was saying, look, it's not that I have to be the leader, but we left the DA because you didn't provide the leadership we needed at the time. And we need an organization that's strong and is going to be decisive. I mean, the work of starting a new political party is hugely challenging. There's lots of people who are infiltrating and trying to undermine and take the organization in different directions, and you've got to have people who are decisive and foresee these things and act definitively to address them. And I think ultimately it didn't happen for that reason, but there's always been ongoing discussions between the two parties because it was always going to make a good fit. And I'll say this because I don't want to be unfair to Mmusi in the remarks that I make, is that he's a hugely charismatic, strong individual. When he speaks, he's captivating. And I think it would have made an excellent team and still may one day, because both of these parties find themselves in a position where their market share is challenging. The centre of South African politics got squeezed hard in this last election, where the peripheries are where the growth lay. And ultimately, both of our parties and others are going to have to reimagine our place in the political marketplace if we're going to move beyond where we are into greater positions.
If I'm going to, I want to go to the multi-party charter, but I want to ask you about why you accepted the position of national chair. You are someone who has always been on the background, not really had any ambitions to be in the front of politics. What made you decide I can be the national chair? And essentially, you are the SG of or the Secretary General, the CEO of the party.
Yeah, it was strange. I mean, a lot of things, these roles developed with the party more than anything else, but. My experience in the DA was that there was a classification of politicians and staff in two different ways, which became very negative in the DA because, the latter became kind of second-rate citizens who didn't have a political voice. Whereas, when we set up ActionSA, we said your voice has got to be directly proportional to your contribution. Whether you are defined as a staff member or a politician is secondary to the question of what value you bring to the organization. Some staff members bring more value than scores of politicians, and vice versa. So we try to tear down that divide to say that everyone's a politician in a political party, whether you work in the background or the foreground. And ultimately, I guess it was just the nature of not having enough people in the organization where you couldn't sit in the background. We didn't have that luxury. I mean, in the beginning, there was literally 5 or 6 people, and media queries would arise. I mean, in the early days, I was the media officer as well. We all had like 5 or 6 different jobs. I mean, Herman was his own secretary. We all had multiple jobs. We all did our own work. And I mean, before long, I suppose you just got thrust into the public space more than there being a conscious decision. But, I knew I could do the work. It wasn't that I'd looked at the work and it terrified me, or that others in those roles are so daunting that I couldn't possibly imagine that I could do it. It's just, it was having to move out of a comfort space and into something that was going to be uncomfortable for me.
And then you started attracting a lot of personalities, a lot of DA personalities, and I imagine that put you in as a target for Helen Zille as well. I mean, a lot of DA leaders, John Moody, Bongani Baloyi, left the DA and came to ActionSA. Was that reassuring to you in the path that you were taking?
It was and it wasn't. So it was good to bring some of those people on board because we were desperately short of experience. And you need political experience in the complex decision-making of a new political party. But at the same time, we had to be very careful not to end up in a direction where the parties just seem to be a kind of, offshoot of the DA, which I suppose has been the challenge for us all along, because it's very easily to be seen as DA light and be branded that way, and to have all the same toxicity issues of being, the offspring of the DA, which, we wanted to avoid. So, at the same time, we were very mindful that we were setting up something that said we were going to be different. And yet you had a lot of people coming from the organization we wanted to be different from. So it was a bit of a double-edged sword for us in that way, I suppose.
I can't imagine how difficult it was for your wife at that time, because most of your time, I would imagine, you're starting a new political party. It can't be easy. It's the hours that you have to put in, time that you have to put into that. How strenuous is that in terms of your personal life as well? Your relationship with your wife, your family, your mom, your dad, your siblings, your friends.
Yeah, very strenuous. I think that strain started from before, when I went to work in the city of Joburg. I think up until then, we weren't yet married at the time, but my now wife was, we could still...
You were still courting her.
Yeah, exactly. So it's showing her the sunny side of life, But no, I think we had much more time together and much less pressurized environment. She was a political person as well. I met her in politics. She was a councillor in Johannesburg. She resigned when Herman and I went into the city, because she just said she kept rocking up at these circles of people who were talking about us. She said, no,
Wow.
I'm not going to be that person. But she's talented and smart enough that she's moved into the private sector and she's doing great work and enjoying herself. But certainly, it's had a major toll on everything. And I think politicians are often very selfish in that kind of way, because we run around doing what we believe in. It's very taxing on us as individuals, but there's always an underappreciation of how taxing it is on everyone else around us. Particularly, you can imagine the launch of ActionSA took place in a hard COVID-19 lockdown. She was sitting a few meters away from me throughout that entire period of time and tearing her hair out in terms of having to listen to all this stuff and deal with all this stuff. But I think the fact that she came from a political background and she's understood what it means to work for something you believe in really does matter. And she's always been an absolute soldier for me that way. She volunteers at our voting station and does the count until 4 o'clock in the morning. And she's been hugely supportive despite all the strain that I think has taken out on both of us.
Did your mom and dad, you've spoken about your mom and dad being academics in the medical field, your father, did they have an affiliation in terms of political parties? And when you told them that you were going to embark on this new project, what was their reaction?
I think they were terrified. I don't think they were ever very excited about me going into politics. I think they saw that it was a good fit for me as a person. But I think they always thought it was going to be a very challenging environment. And I think they were very nervous about the change that I'd been making because, they come from a neighborhood that's been DA and DA for so long that, quite frankly, that community is there in Durban will continue being DA forever and a day. It's just the nature of those places. So all of their friends and all of their colleagues and all of their circles would have been strongly opposed to the move that I was making. But, I was very proud of them because, I think they were proud of me. They stuck with me. They didn't always understand it, and it definitely took a lot of conversations. But they were always with me, and I've watched them develop their own political consciousness with me as I've gone along this journey, which has been fascinating to observe in them, to the point where, they can sit in front of you now and tell you about these things. And, they have their own strong views in these matters and, canvass in their own circles. So it's been an interesting development watching people who are obviously far advanced in their lives and their experiences, and yet they're undergoing a bit of a journey at this time. So I think I've probably put them through a lot as well. And if they're listening to this, I apologize.